and thanks for joining us for another Molle Motorsports tech presentation. In some of our previous segments, we've covered assembly checks and measurements required to get the piston ready for assembly. Today we're going to focus in a little bit closer on actually installing rings on pistons and preparing the piston for installation in the bore. Orientation is particularly important on tops and second rings that will many times have a directional feature designed into the ring, whether it's a bevel to introduce twist or the taper on the second ring that dictates its ability to scrape oil. No matter what the indication or type of mark that's used, the note on the ring almost always points up towards the top of the piston. An oil ring most generally isn't directionally specific, particularly for your expanders and spacers. They can be installed on the piston either way, and most rails won't have a direction that they have to be installed either up or down, or if they do, similar to the top and second rings, they'll be noted accordingly. One more increasingly common exception to that is the two-piece or single-piece rings. Sometimes the faces of the scrapers that are built into the ring will also have taper built into them, but again, like the top and second rings, they'll have a notation or mark indicating their direction in the engine. One common question that we see is an occurrence where the rings have been unpackaged and either mixed or were taken out of the package and not marked according to tops and seconds. A very quick way to distinguish what is what is to look at the face of the ring. Typically your second rings, if it's an uncoated ring, may share the common phosphate or black coating over the entire ring. Holding them together, it's easy to pick out the coated face of the top rings. Some rings aren't this obvious, and in cases like those, it's always best to give us a call and we can walk you through either some radial dimensions of the rings and or looking at some unique features of bevel orientation versus the top marking, etc., to absolutely distinguish which ring is which for the set that you have. The last thing we need to address before we're ready to install the rings is the lubrication of the rings. While there are a multitude of different oils and formulations available and just as many opinions to go with them, we're going to take a middle-of-the-road approach and recommend that if you're using a good break-in oil to start the engine up, the same oil should be used to lubricate the pistons and rings. On a couple opposite ends of the spectrums, if you look at some of the very lightweight solvents and lightweight oils, lubrication properties might be marginal, and two, they also have more of a tendency to evaporate. While everyone has intentions of building the engine, firing it up, putting it in the car immediately, sometimes we know that other factors keep that from happening, and an engine may set for months before it's ready to install. So we want to make sure that we maintain good lubrication when the engine is ready to be fired. On the opposite end of that, the very heavy oils or some of the very tacky, sticky assembly lubes will prevent the ring from moving freely in the groove, and that rotation is something that's important to the proper function of the ring, and we want to make sure that it remains intact again when the engine is ready to be installed and fired up. To touch briefly on the conventional versus synthetic oil for break-in, granted there are many OEMs that successfully use synthetic oil right from startup under very controlled conditions. And while it is possible to duplicate those results, the conservative, safe approach is to use a conventional grade motor oil for most general applications. Regardless of your choice for the type of lubrication to use, only a light amount is necessary on the flanks of the rings. Ideally, what we're looking for is just a wetted surface on the flanks, and very simple to do with an oily finger, and simply wiping the surface of the rings. Typical expanders shouldn't require any additional lubrication, but all the flat rails, tops and seconds. And again, all we're looking for is a wetted surface on the ring, and we'll wipe off any excess oil that remains after we're done. One last thing that we'll look at before starting the final assembly is a couple of different techniques for installing the ring on the piston. Without any tools, it is certainly possible to expand the ring by hand and fit it into the groove. The one thing you'll notice is we're not spiraling the ring onto the piston. Not only can this damage the ring, but it can also create burrs that'll be rolled into the groove with the ring. One exception to that you'll see is when we come to the very small thin oil rails. In this case, we will actually be spiraling the ring. To start our assembly, we're going to be installing a set of our new HV385 1mm, 1mm, 2mm rings. This particular piston is a non-interrupted pin design, but if it were, you would have a support rail that gets installed on the lower flank of the oil ring groove, but from that point forward, all of the ring assembly would be identical. And we're going to start with our expander first, and we're going to lay it in the groove and just make sure that our ends are butted and not overlapped. Next, we'll add the bottom rail to the oil ring assembly, and I'm going to start approximately 45 degrees away from the gap and spiral the ring onto the piston, crossing over the gap, using it to lock the expander into place. And then we will do the exact opposite with the upper rail, starting at, again, approximately 45 degrees from the gap, spiraling it on, crossing over the gap, and then just checking to make sure everything rotates freely. For our second ring, we'll check the orientation of our mark, expand it just enough to get it over the OD of the piston, and check that it moves freely in the groove. And lastly, we'll add the top ring, checking the orientation of the directional mark, expanding just enough to install it over the piston, and making sure that everything moves freely. A quick word on ring gaps. There is no one right specific orientation for ring gaps. As soon as the engine starts to operate, if your honing was done properly, the rings will rotate relative to each other on the piston. A good rule of thumb is to start with the tops and seconds 180 degrees away from each other, whether that's skirt axis, pin axis, 35-degree angle. That's entirely up to the builder's preference. But as long as you've got them separated, that truly fulfills the any criteria for ring end gap orientation when it's in the engine. So with the rings installed on the piston, we're ready for our final assembly in the block. If you join us next time, we'll share some tips and tricks on that process as well. Be sure to follow us on YouTube and Facebook for other videos, and thanks for watching.